North Korea just issued a warning to France. Not about missiles, not about sanctions, about Africa. Specifically, the Sahel, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger. Pyongyang told Paris to back off, stay out, respect limits. Let that sink in. A nuclear-armed hermit state, isolated for 70 years, is now lecturing a European power about its behavior in West Africa. Why? Because the Sahel isn't just expelling French troops anymore. It's building something the West fears more than coups, more than terrorism, more than Russian mercenaries. A model of survival without permission. And if that model works, the entire post-colonial system collapses. 3 landlocked countries are about to rewrite the rules of global power. And the world's most isolated regime just picked a side. 3 landlocked nations in West Africa just became the most contested piece of real estate in 21st century geopolitics. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, collectively known as the Sahel, are now at the center of what analysts are calling a coordinated containment strategy. And the architects? France, the United States, and their European allies. This isn't about terrorism anymore. This is about who controls the future of a region sitting on uranium, gold, and the ideological fault line between Western influence and African sovereignty. For decades, the Sahel was governed by a quiet agreement. France provides security, trains the military, stations troops, and in return, maintains access. Access to resources, access to political leverage, access to influence over who leads and how they lead. But in 2020, that arrangement began to fracture. Military coups in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger didn't just overthrow governments. They expelled French forces, demanded the closure of bases, and pivoted toward Russia. What followed wasn't reconciliation. It was encirclement. Western powers didn't retreat from the Sahel. They repositioned. France redeployed troops to neighboring countries: Benin, Togo, Ivory Coast, Senegal. The United States expanded its drone base in Niger before being asked to leave, then quietly reinforced intelligence sharing agreements with Chad and Nigeria. Germany and Italy opened new military cooperation frameworks in the region. On paper, these moves are about counterterrorism and stability. But the pattern is unmistakable. A network of bases, intelligence hubs, and diplomatic pressure points now surrounds the 3 breakaway states. This is Containment Doctrine, African Edition. And it's not just military. Economic pressure is mounting. ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, imposed sanctions on Niger within hours of its July 2023 coup. Borders were closed. Flights were grounded. Assets were frozen. The speed and coordination suggested external influence. France and the European Union publicly backed the sanctions. The message was clear: step out of line, and the entire regional architecture moves against you. For Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, this looked less like African unity and more like a Western-backed economic siege. Is this a defensive strategy, or the opening act of a broader campaign to restore influence? The Sahel's new military governments aren't passive. They've formed the Alliance of Sahel States, a political and defense bloc designed to resist external interference. They've signed security agreements with Russia, invited Wagner Group mercenaries, now rebranded under Africa Corps, and begun exploring economic partnerships with China. They've also launched a media and narrative war, framing their struggle as a fight against neo-colonialism. And in many capitals across Africa, that message is resonating. But the West has leverage. Uranium from Niger powered a significant portion of France's nuclear reactors. Gold from Mali and Burkina Faso flows through international markets regulated by Western financial systems. Cut off from SWIFT banking, international credit, and regional trade, these nations face economic suffocation. The question isn't whether the West has tools. It's whether they're willing to deploy them fully. And early signs suggest they are. Meanwhile, Nigeria and Chad, both Western-aligned, both strategically critical, are being positioned as counterweights. Nigeria hosts U.S. military assets and shares a long border with Niger. Chad, despite its own political instability, remains a key French ally and a military transit hub. If the Sahel states are the targets, Nigeria and Chad are the anchors of the containment ring. Their cooperation is essential. Their stability, however, is not guaranteed. What happens next could redefine the region. This is no longer a story about coups or jihadism. It's about whether a new model of African governance, one that rejects Western military presence and pursues alternative alliances, can survive coordinated external pressure. The Sahel is testing a hypothesis. Can sovereignty be asserted without economic collapse? Can security be achieved without Western partnerships? Can a landlocked region, surrounded by hostile neighbors and cut off from international systems, hold its ground? 3 military officers you've probably never heard of just became the most dangerous men in Western foreign policy circles. Captain Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso, Colonel Assimi Goïta in Mali, General Abdourahmane Tiani in Niger. They didn't storm international summits or threaten NATO. They did something far more disruptive. They said no. And in a region where France, the United States, and Europe have dictated terms for over half a century, that refusal is being treated like a declaration of war. These aren't elected presidents. They're military leaders who seized power through coups, events that typically trigger sanctions, condemnation, and isolation. But something unexpected happened. Instead of collapsing under pressure, they doubled down. They expelled French troops, closed Western military bases, rejected calls to restore civilian rule on Western timelines. And in doing so, they became symbols of something larger, a defiant Africa that refuses to play by the old rules. Traoré is the youngest. At 36, he leads one of the world's poorest countries, facing one of its deadliest insurgencies. His speeches are blunt, unpolished, and unapologetic. He's called out France by name, accused former colonial powers of exploiting Burkina Faso's resources, and framed his government's struggle as a fight for dignity. In Ouagadougou, crowds chant his name. Across social media, his clips go viral. He's not polished like a diplomat. He's raw, and that rawness resonates. Goïta took power in Mali in 2020, then again in 2021 when the transitional president tried to maneuver around him. He's methodical, cautious, less visible than Traoré, but arguably more strategic. Under his leadership, Mali ended its defense agreements with France, invited Russian mercenaries, and began realigning its foreign policy toward Moscow and other non-Western powers. The French called it a betrayal. Goïta called it sovereignty. Tiani is the latest. His July 2023 coup in Niger was the most consequential. Niger wasn't just another Sahel state, it was the West's last reliable partner in the region. It hosted American drones, French special forces, and European training missions. It was the anchor. When Tiani's presidential guard detained President Mohamed Bazoum and declared military rule, the entire Western security architecture in the Sahel began to unravel. Within weeks, France and the United States were asked to leave. And they did. Is this ideological conviction or political survival dressed as revolution? Western governments have been quick to frame these leaders as autocrats, coup makers, and threats to democracy. And there's truth in that framing. None of them were elected, and all of them suspended constitutional processes. But the narrative they're selling to their populations is different. They argue that the so-called democratic governments they overthrew were powerless, corrupt, and subordinate to foreign interests. They argue that elections supervised by Paris didn't produce sovereignty. They produced clientelism. And in countries where French military presence didn't stop terrorism, but instead seemed to perpetuate it, that argument has traction. The Western response has been telling. Sanctions were immediate. Diplomatic isolation followed. ECOWAS, the regional bloc historically aligned with France, threatened military intervention in Niger. But no invasion came. Instead, the sanctions tightened. The rhetoric hardened. And the Sahel's new leaders became, intentionally or not, martyrs for a broader Pan-African cause. From Senegal to South Africa, activists, intellectuals, and opposition figures began invoking their names. Not because they're Democrats, they're not, but because they represent resistance. This is where the stakes become clear. The West isn't just losing military bases or mining contracts. It's losing the narrative. For decades, Western governments positioned themselves as partners in African development, stability, and progress. But when 3 military officers expelled their troops and nothing catastrophic happened, in fact, when those officers gained legitimacy, it raised an uncomfortable question. Were Western forces ever the solution, or were they part of the problem? Traoré, Goïta, and Tiani didn't create this sentiment. They tapped into it. And that's what makes them dangerous. Not because they're military strongmen, Africa has seen plenty of those, but because they're military strongmen with a cause that resonates beyond their borders. They become the faces of a broader ideological shift, the rejection of post-colonial dependency. What happens next could redefine the region. If these leaders succeed in stabilizing their countries, securing alternative partnerships, and maintaining popular support, they'll prove that African states can chart independent paths without Western approval. If they fail, if their economies collapse, if terrorism worsens, if their governments turn repressive, they'll become cautionary tales, and the West will reclaim the narrative. The Sahel just adopted the world's most dangerous survival strategy: isolation as ideology. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are no longer trying to appease the West. They're not negotiating sanctions relief or seeking diplomatic reentry. Instead, they're doing something far more radical. They're building a model of governance that assumes permanent hostility from Europe and America. And they're looking to 2 powers that know how to survive under pressure: Russia and China. Some analysts are going further, drawing comparisons to North Korea's decades-long defiance. That comparison might sound extreme, but the logic is becoming uncomfortably similar. This isn't about ideology in the traditional sense. It's about leverage. For decades, African states operated within a framework where Western approval was essential. For aid, for investment, for legitimacy. Lose that approval and your economy collapses. Your military weakens. Your government falls. But what happens when a country stops caring about that approval? What happens when survival, not integration, becomes the strategy? Russia moved in fast. After French forces were expelled, Wagner Group mercenaries, now rebranded as Africa Corps, arrived in Mali, then Burkina Faso. They're not peacekeepers. They're contractors, paid to protect regimes and fight insurgents with methods Western militaries publicly avoid. Moscow provides weapons, training, and political cover at the United Nations. In return, it gains influence, mining rights, and a foothold in a region it was locked out of for decades. The relationship isn't built on shared values. It's built on mutual benefit and a shared adversary: the West. China's role is quieter but deeper. Beijing isn't sending troops. It's building infrastructure, roads, telecommunications networks, energy projects. It's offering loans without the governance conditions that come with Western aid. And crucially, it's buying what the Sahel has to sell: gold, uranium, and strategic minerals. China doesn't ask about democracy or human rights. It asks about contracts. For governments under sanctions and diplomatic siege, that's not a flaw, it's a feature. Is this pragmatism or the beginning of a new dependency? But here's where the North Korea comparison starts to make sense. Pyongyang survived 70 years of sanctions, isolation, and hostility by turning defiance into national identity. It militarized its society, centralized power, and conditioned its population to view hardship as the price of sovereignty. The Sahel isn't there yet, but the rhetorical framework is emerging. Leaders like Ibrahim Traoré speak openly about sacrifice, about enduring economic pain for the sake of independence. State media in Mali and Burkina Faso frame sanctions not as punishment for bad governance, but as proof of Western aggression. The message is clear: if the West wants to break you, the only option is to refuse to break. This mindset has consequences. Economies are contracting. Access to international credit is gone. Regional trade is disrupted. Inflation is rising. But rather than triggering collapse, the pressure is being absorbed. Governments are tightening control, mobilizing populations around nationalist rhetoric. and redistributing what resources remain toward military and security priorities. It's not sustainable in the long term, but in the short term, it's holding. And that's the gamble. The Sahel's new governments are betting that they can outlast the sanctions, that alternative partnerships with Russia and China can provide enough economic and military support to prevent total collapse, and that their populations will tolerate hardship if it's framed as resistance rather than failure. It's a high-risk strategy, but it's not irrational. History shows that regimes under siege can survive far longer than their opponents expect, especially when they're willing to accept costs that democratic governments cannot. This is where the stakes become clear. If this model works, if the Sahel stabilizes, maintains sovereignty, and builds functional economies outside the Western system, it becomes a template. Other African nations facing Western pressure might look at Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger and think, maybe we don't need their approval either. Maybe isolation, if managed correctly, is survivable. Maybe dignity is worth the price. But if it fails, if the economies implode, if insurgencies worsen, if the populations turn on their leaders, then the West reclaims the narrative. Sanctions work. Isolation collapses regimes. There is no alternative to integration. Right now, the outcome is uncertain. The Sahel is running an experiment in geopolitical defiance, and the results will matter far beyond West Africa. Because this isn't just about 3 countries rejecting France. It's about whether the global system built after colonialism, where Western powers hold the keys to legitimacy, finance, and security, can be challenged. And if it can, what replaces it? This is no longer a regional crisis. What's unfolding in the Sahel across Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger is being described by some as the most significant assertion of African sovereignty since decolonization. Not because these countries are the richest or the most powerful or the most stable, but because they've drawn a line. And on one side of that line is a century of external control. On the other side is the unknown. The West is treating this like a containment problem. The Sahel is treating it like a war for dignity. And the outcome will determine whether Africa's future is negotiated in Paris, Washington, and Brussels, or in Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey. For 60 years, the post-colonial bargain held. African states gained independence, but the terms were written elsewhere. France retained military bases, currency control through the CFA franc, and political influence over who governed and how. The United States built drone infrastructure and intelligence networks under the banner of counterterrorism. European powers framed their presence as partnership, but the power dynamics told a different story. Resources flowed out, decisions flowed in, and any government that challenged the arrangement faced pressure, isolation, or worse. The Sahel broke that bargain. Not gradually, not diplomatically, abruptly. Military coups removed pro-Western governments. French troops were expelled. American bases were closed. And rather than collapsing into chaos, these states began building something else. An alliance rooted not in Western approval, but in collective resistance. The alliance of Sahel states isn't just a defense pact. It's a political declaration. Sovereignty is non-negotiable, even if it costs everything. And the cost is real. Sanctions have severed access to international finance. ECOWAS, the regional bloc once seen as a vehicle for African unity, has become a mechanism for isolation. Borders are closed. Trade is disrupted. The Sahel is surrounded not by armies, at least not yet, but by economic pressure, diplomatic hostility, and a network of Western-aligned neighbors. Chad to the east, Nigeria to the south, Senegal and Ivory Coast to the west. Every direction is a potential pressure point. Is this a sustainable strategy or a slow-motion siege? But something unexpected is happening. Instead of fracturing under pressure, the Sahel is consolidating. Populations that were once divided by ethnicity, language, and borders are rallying around a shared narrative. We are under attack, and we will not submit. Street protests in Ouagadougou wave Russian flags not because of ideological alignment with Moscow, but because Russia represents the opposite of France. Social media campaigns frame the struggle as Pan-African, invoking the language of liberation movements from decades past. The rhetoric is powerful, and it's spreading. This isn't just about 3 countries anymore. Across the continent, opposition movements, civil society groups, and younger generations are watching. In Senegal, protesters have clashed with police while chanting slogans in support of the Sahel. In South Africa, intellectuals are writing essays framing the region's defiance as a model for the rest of Africa. In Kenya, debates are erupting over whether the continent should continue hosting Western military bases. The Sahel has become a symbol, and symbols, once activated, are difficult to contain. The West's response has been calibrated but firm. Sanctions remain in place. Military cooperation with neighboring states has intensified. Diplomatic messaging emphasizes terrorism, instability, and the risks of Russian and Chinese influence. The framing is strategic. This isn't about sovereignty, it's about security. But that framing is losing traction. Because for many Africans, the question isn't whether the Sahel's governments are democratic. It's whether any African government has the right to expel foreign troops without facing collective punishment. This is where the stakes become clear. If the Sahel survives this moment, if it stabilizes, builds alternative partnerships, and maintains internal cohesion, it proves that African states can exist outside the Western system. It proves that the post-colonial order is optional. And that's a precedent that reshapes everything. Every military base, every aid agreement, every trade deal, every assumption about who holds power in Africa. But if the Sahel collapses, if economies implode, if insurgencies overwhelm governments, if populations turn against their leaders, then the lesson is different. Sovereignty without Western support is unsustainable. Defiance leads to ruin. And the old order reasserts itself, more entrenched than before. Right now, the outcome is unwritten. The Sahel is encircled, under-resourced, and facing threats from every direction. But it's also awake. And that awakening, the realization that dignity might be worth more than stability, that independence might justify hardship, is what makes this moment historic. Because this isn't just about 3 countries in West Africa. It's about whether the idea of African sovereignty, spoken about for decades but rarely tested, can actually be defended. The Sahel is testing it, and the world is deciding how to respond.